Welcome to the deep dive. Imagine an election system. Well, where the rules for who votes, how they vote, maybe even how the votes get counted are just radically different from what we know now. Today, we're diving into some proposals that could really reshape American elections. We're looking at a stack of sources outlining some pretty bold ideas. Our mission here is simple. Pull out the core proposals, look at the different angles, the perspectives around them. It's all based on excerpts from one key source, which translates to something like Trump, Executive Order for Voter ID and Abolition of Mail-in Voting. Okay, let's unpack this. So, kicking us off, the source points to a recent declaration from Donald Trump on Truth Social, apparently. He said he'll issue an executive order, and the quote is, "Voter ID must be part of every vote. No exceptions. We'll issue executive order to make this happen." That's pretty direct. A nationwide voter ID requirement. Setting aside the politics for a sec, what are the actual, practical challenges of doing that, implementing it across such a varied system?
That's a really key question because, a president can issue an executive order, but elections, they're mostly run state by state. So the idea of a truly nationwide voter ID system imposed federally, well, that runs into some big legal hurdles and just logistical headaches for the states, honestly. It really highlights that tension, federal power versus the state's traditional role in running their own elections.
Right. So if universal voter ID is one pillar here, what's the next piece? The source then talks about mail-in voting. It details Trump's statement that mail-in voting won't be allowed except for the severely ill and military personnel serving abroad. That's a huge change, really narrows who can vote by mail. What's the sort of rationale given for that kind of restriction, and how does it connect back to, say, 2020?
Well, this proposal is framed very much around preventing voter fraud, especially, following the 2020 election. The source does mention Trump's claims about widespread fraud, which, he linked to his loss to President Biden. And it also points to claims about large numbers of non-citizens voting. The source notes that's illegal, yes, but also statistically pretty rare. So the stated concern is this idea of vulnerability in mail-in systems. That's definitely fueled a lot of debate, regardless of, the actual data on fraud frequency.
Okay, now let's pivot to something maybe even more fundamental. How votes are cast and counted. Electronic machines. Our source highlights Trump's long-standing call to get rid of electronic voting completely, advocating instead for, paper ballots and counting by hand. For our listeners, maybe just break down the arguments here. What are the main points for going back to paper, and what do election officials say in response?
Sure. The push for paper often comes from wanting something that feels maybe more transparent, more auditable. Every vote leaves a physical piece of paper. But then you connect that to what election officials say, and they raise some serious counterpoints. They argue that switching entirely to paper ballots and manual counting, that would make the whole process way longer, much more expensive. And, interestingly, potentially less accurate than using machines for counting, especially in big races. Think about waiting possibly weeks for results. Plus, the risk of human error just goes up with manual counts. It really throws that tension into sharp relief, doesn't it? Security versus efficiency.
Yeah, that's a massive trade-off to think about. So putting it all together for you listening, what does this mean? We've looked at proposals for universal voter ID, big restrictions on mail-in voting, a move away from electronic machines, and we've heard the stated reasons, but also the counter-arguments from election officials.
Exactly. It's definitely a complex picture, lots of different views on how best to keep the democratic process safe and sound. What this deep dive really shows is that these discussions, they force us to weigh different values against each other, right? Security against accessibility, efficiency against sort of manual verification. And it's not just theory. Studies have looked into this, like how strict voter ID laws might impact certain groups more than others. But on the flip side, even the perception of weak security can damage public trust, no matter the actual level of fraud.
We've covered some really impactful proposals today. So for you, our listener, maybe the big question to mull over is this. How do we find that balance? The need for secure elections, but also making sure voting is broad and accessible for everyone who's eligible. What specific steps do you think could achieve both without really sacrificing one for the other? Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.